Ryan McCarthy, thank you for being here and really appreciate your time and talking with you. So I guess what I was really interested, what really drew me to your profile was, well, first where you're working in West Virginia, your interest in Appalachian storytelling. So I was wondering first if you could share your background and how you became interested in Appalachian storytelling.
Sure, I'm happy to pick it up from there. First and foremost, thank you so much for having me. I really look forward to this conversation. And I'm speaking to you from my office, which is in my hometown of Martinsburg, West Virginia. And I have been serving my hometown as a primary care doctor in an old-fashioned manner now for almost 20 years. I still feel like I'm new, but I'm certainly not. When I say old-fashioned, I am an internal medicine doctor by training. And I know now in the middle of life that I was always destined to be somebody's doctor. And what I mean by that is I always envisioned myself as somebody who had longitudinal relationships with patients. And as somebody who teaches residents and medical students, many people don't see that. They see themselves as an expert in certain things and they want to solve a certain problem, and we need that. But I always saw myself as somebody's doctor. And the old-fashioned part that I referred to before is that I see patients in an office setting, but I also continue to see them in a hospital. And that legacy and that heritage was commonplace across America. But as we all know, that has really, really changed dramatically. Where if this is the office and this is the hospital, they used to be linked, and now they're not. They're separate worlds. But I still inhabit both, and I know now that that really set the scene for why I've been so interested in stories, because I'm immersed in people's lives and their stories intimately, because I follow them in and out of the hospital, but also because these are people that I know. I have the incredible privilege of caring for former teachers of mine, neighbors, people that raised me, people that helped bring me to where I am. So that was just the environment that I lived in long before I had any concept of what narrative medicine or narrative practices were.
Yeah, and I was wondering too, old-fashioned medicine. In my era, doctors also did house calls,
Hmm.
and they picked up things, that they would never pick up in an office or a hospital. I was wondering if that's also part of your practice, or has that been part of your experience as well?
It has. In the Appalachian tradition of healthcare, I've been on many home visits, and I have seen people at the end of life in their home, whether they're in palliative care or hospice. I have, during times of COVID, done that. And there are patients who are infirm that myself and my office mates, we all have done that. So yeah, that is, you really learn a lot when you step into somebody's home. Um, yeah, that has definitely been a part of the medical tradition I am in now.
Yeah, I was one of my first careers was as a family therapist, and I never learned more about patients than when I went into their home. I would see something completely different. They had
Sure.
a public persona. You'd see more of a private persona, I think, when you were actually in their space, and they
Mm.
would treat you differently. I just wonder, how do you see the tradition of storytelling in influencing health and well-being in the Appalachian community?
It's a great question, and I think about it a lot. Long before I got into narrative medicine, or before I was able to articulate that I had an interest in that, I have told many medical students that I'm a collector of stories. I mean, that's what happens when patients come in. Something has happened, and maybe it's a short, acute story of I fell off the deck, or I was bitten by a dog, or maybe it's a much longer tale, and this is the most recent acute chapter in a much longer volume. And so I have been marinating and listening and been the repository of stories for a long time, because ultimately, that's really where I'm able to help people. My patients expect me to be competent in medical care, medicines and testing and all of that for sure. That's we have to start with that. But then I need to take that competence and I need to basically uncork a situation where somebody feels comfortable, where they can tell me their story. And we know in American healthcare that depending on where you look and read, patients report that doctors will very quickly interrupt them after they start telling their story. And the longer I've gone on, the more I've realized that you really want to prompt somebody and then you want to listen. I've become kind of a peripheral character observer of their story, and I often need to ask them some things to help clarify and understand. But primary care internal medicine is all about storytelling on behalf of the patient and story listening on my part. So, as I said before, these are people I know. So intimacy and personal connection is a key part of the storytelling environment where I work. I think a shared sense of place. I mean, later today, I'm sure I'm going to bump into patients at the farm market. This shared history, many of us, where we have newcomers into our community, but I also take care of patients who have been here for generations, and so I think a lot of that shared experience is the storytelling of Appalachia. Kinfolk, neighbors helping neighbors, knowing one another. I don't think anything would sum up my local culture better than if I were to be stopped on the side of the road on the way home, 5 people will stop and ask if I'm okay.
Yeah, and I can imagine that the people that you've grown up with, the people who are now your patients, must take some pride in the fact of where you are right now. You're an
Mm.
important figure in the community, and they've seen you grow up, and now you've seen them grow up as well, and also pass on. And so it's a really intimate community and relationship. It sounds like that you have. Yeah. I was just wondering, what are some of the common themes, if any, that you find in how your patients tell stories? Are there things that you uh, see over the course of your work that are thematic or imagistic? What do you think?
Yeah, I think there are lots of themes, and one of the uh, one of the internal medicine tricks that I have to do is it's really important for me to understand why somebody is coming today. And in healthcare, we call that the chief complaint. Like, why are you here today? And one of the themes of my stories for my patients is they intrinsically don't go back to why they made the appointment. They go back to the very beginning of where it started. And so I kind of have to sometimes and say, well, okay, before you tell me where this started, why did you make the appointment? Because then that allows me to interpret the entire story, coming to a crescendo, if you will, as to why they made the appointment. Um, so that's very common. And I think other themes, my patients often talk about when they were unable to do something and that prompted them to get medical care. Like I had this pain and I was dealing with it until I was unable to work. I had problems with my vision until it affected my ability to do something and I couldn't teach, or I was and then people will give me very specific Appalachian. I was at church, or I had a conversation at the school. And so many of their stories talk about being prompted maybe by a family or a concerned friend, where a lot of the stories are built on, I can deal with this, this ache, this pain. I'm going to cope. I'm going to move forward. I'm going to do it myself. That Appalachian, not going to run into the doctor, that is a huge theme for problems big and small that come into my office.
So yeah, it sounds like a fair amount of stoicism,
For sure.
not depending on others, but at the same time uh, being able to reach out. I wonder too if their tendency to want to tell the full story and not simply what brought them in
Mm.
today is because of you. They know
Mm.
you. You're a collector of stories. Do you think you engender that kind of long form, storytelling in terms of your medical practice.
I think you're right. And I think people talk more when they feel safe than people share more when they feel respected. And yes, this is a deeper and a richer experience that I have now. And maybe that's why it's even more satisfying now than it ever has been, because not only my relationships with these folks longer, but we're just on a whole different level. And to go back to, that's just prompted me to think about something. So I've said this to medical students that I've worked with. In the early years of my practice, patients would come in and they would give me all of the surface stuff. I need a flu shot. I need a mammogram. Can you refill my medicines? I have diabetes. I have high blood pressure. I'm a smoker. We'd have all of that, nuts and bolts. But as the years have gone on, boy, the layers of trust and respect and the stories have gotten deeper. I was probably 5 or 10 years in before I started hearing all of the childhood trauma. Hey, I feel safe enough to tell you that now. Or I'm going to tell you about my divorce or my affair, and I can appreciate now that that's because we had a relationship of shared trust. And so the stories are way more complicated and deeper now. And I mean, there are days I go home just feeling drained and exhausted because there was almost nothing perfunctory that happened because we were both looking forward and backward. Sometimes it's childhood trauma, and sometimes it's end of life planning and palliative care and thinking about the end. And yeah, it's all deep and rich and beautiful and exhausting at the same time.
Yeah, I was fascinated by the story on your website about being a confessor. You told a story
Mm.
about a woman that confessed something to you, and so that was certainly I can share that was part of my background, having grown up Catholic, having to go to confession every Saturday, trying to listen in the confession booth to what other people were confessing became sort of those kinds of stories really interested me, and
Mm.
so I guess I wonder about, uh, and this is personal, I guess, your religious background and how that prepared you. Did the stories that I'm assuming you went to church? I was just
Mm.
assuming that the stories that you might have heard growing up, Bible stories, might have had some influence. Do you think?
Oh, I think absolutely religion and spirituality have influenced me. I've been a member of the local Catholic Church for a long time. Um, uh, Attended a wedding there, the same church where I was married over the weekend, and I am very much omnivorous in terms of religion and spirituality, where my patients come from all backgrounds. And hospital chaplains have really done a great job over the years of helping me understand the concept of chaplaincy, of helping see a moment from somebody's point of view. And spirituality and religion are important not just to me, but to my patients, and understanding what do they believe and what is important to them and their value structure. Oh, absolutely, Tony. I mean, my own personal faith helps me understand that it's important to other people. And we all bring certain constructs of, am I a good person? Have I done enough? Have I met my expectations as a mother, wife, husband, father, son, and the spiritual components? So in my office, we have a lot of conversations about that. And yeah, I would say that I do a lot of pastoral counseling in addition to a lot of nuts and bolts mental health, well-being, self-help, self-esteem, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, all of that. It gets rolled into a really complex picture where spirituality and faith is always on the menu. I don't shy away from it. And I can't emphasize enough that it's really trying to understand, what does this person in front of me, what are their values? How is that informing their experience and their distress? How will that be their support structure? Um, because especially houses of worship are critical in Appalachia for where, I mean, that's the Appalachian living room.
Hmm.
And so yes, I am often tying people back to, well, have you talked to your pastor about that? And you told me about this at your church, and that's a great place of support for the following. So it's ubiquitous in my office.
Yeah, you remind me of something that Kurt Vonnegut talked about in an interview that I heard. Basically it was whether you believe in God or not, it's important to belong to a spiritual community.
Mm,
Because we need to be connected somehow in a
mm.
community, and whether God is part of it is a personal choice. But going to church doesn't have to necessarily be a profession of faith as much as the need to belong to something bigger than us. And what do people outside of Appalachia need to know about storytelling in Appalachian and the traditions? As you know, there's a lot of I think bias and misunderstanding about the region, which is really pretty huge when you think about it. You're in one section of Appalachia, but it extends
Mm.
from New York to Georgia. What do we need to know about Appalachia and storytelling traditions if we're not from that area?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think about it a lot. And Appalachia is often forgotten and ignored. It is often regarded as backwards and backwoods. And I can tell you, I live in a valley just west of where I'm now, and the mountain between me and that valley is big enough that it keeps people on this side really from going there. And
Yeah.
so I almost have like an Appalachian experience microcosm just traveling home because my valley, Back Creek Valley, is very dark at night and there's very little there. And it reminds me that Appalachia writ large is we're just far enough west of places like Interstate 81 and Interstate 95 that many people travel through here and don't think of us. And so as a result of that, I think it's easy to misunderstand or just be completely ignorant of cultures that are out here. And Appalachia is so diverse. So that would be number one, is that, if outsiders think like, hey, Appalachia is just full of basic white people, could not be farther from the truth. Economically, it's very diverse. Culturally, it's very diverse. There have been various immigrant groups that have come here and made substantial contributions to West Virginia. Um, Cultural heritage, from music to cooking to writing to speaking, is tremendously rich, and goes back a long way. And so I think there's a lot of cultural baggage that we get wrapped into that is completely inaccurate. But I understand that that's the reality for people, and I don't, the longer I go, the less angry I'm about that because it's human nature. If I lived far from here, who knows? Maybe I might have those same misconceptions about people in West Virginia or Western Pennsylvania or parts of Maryland and Virginia. Um, and it's what we do as humans, is we just don't understand the other. And so Appalachians are very other.
Yeah, that's one of the big challenges of living in America. It's such a
Mm,
diverse place, um, and we don't really understand each other. We're all of us are locked into our
mm.
little region, and I spend my time back and forth between Philadelphia and New York, and it's as biased as any place.
I
It
would think, yeah.
really is. We've got our own value system, and so I was wondering too about you mentioned all the ethnic groups, perhaps that have had an influence on the culture there. Native American culture, is that still, do you think, part of the culture? Does it have an influence still in your area of West
I think
Virginia?
Yeah, I think for where I am in West Virginia, I think the answer is there would be very little of that, that I can see and feel on a regular daily basis. I'm in the part of West Virginia that's in the Shenandoah Valley, and we share that with Virginia to our south. And I think as we head farther west in Appalachia, going into the rest of West Virginia and into Kentucky, there would be more of that. But here in my neighborhood in West Virginia, not a whole lot. It's interesting when you mentioned, what people's misconceptions. I think one of the great examples I like to start with is, so, you know, the state snack of West Virginia is something called a pepperoni roll. And the reason that it is that Italian immigrants came to West Virginia, and this became the perfect thing to take with you if you were going to have lunch in a coal mine. And so this was Italian food to go for the working man. It was coal miners at that time. And the pepperoni rolls heritage and love across this state speaks to the fact that these Italians came here, and this was in the late 1800s, early 1900s, kind of at the peak of the beginning of timber mining, coal and gas. And that, you know, has lingered for over 100 years. And I think that's a great example. And it wasn't just Italian immigrants, but other Eastern Europeans, and they brought their cultural traditions, their food traditions, their music traditions, and their storytelling as well. So that's just one example of diversity that people may not be aware of.
Yeah, my father's father, his side of the family emigrated to Pennsylvania, the Appalachian part of Pennsylvania, and worked in the coal mine. So
Mm.
I have a lot of relatives that worked as coal miners in Pennsylvania, and the story the story goes my grandfather also worked part-time for the local undertaker, and when he saw
Wow.
someone who had been crushed by a coal mining accident, he decided I better get out of here and try something else, and left and
Mm.
came to outside of Philadelphia and New Jersey. So yeah, it's so it's fascinating to hear that the pepperoni roll is an important part of the local cuisine.
Mm.
I would have never thought that. You know, one thing too I wanted to ask you about that I was really fascinated by was your in the your work at West Virginia University Humanities. You mentioned something about a new model of narrative medicine steeped in Appalachian values. Can you say more about that? That really got my attention.
Yeah, I'd
How
be
does
happy to. Yeah, I'd be happy to speak to that. And so 4 years ago, I was minding my own business and was, like everybody else, blindsided by a pandemic. And I had no idea what narrative medicine was. And as an act of survival, I know now that I created a project called Healthcare is Human, with the simple goal initially just to chronicle my own experience of working in my hometown, because I knew I was going to see everything. Whatever COVID brought to Martinsburg, West Virginia, I was going to see it. And so I wanted to record it in granular detail. And very quickly, that creative urge escalated, and it escalated into a much larger project of interviewing healthcare workers where they would get to narrate their first person experience of working in healthcare. And I started specifically with underappreciated, underrepresented folks working in cashiers, security, IT, technical facilities. I thought that their voices were not being heard. And then the project also then involved photography, really incredible photographs of these workers in vivo, basically working on the job. And it was really just started as a way to document what I knew was a worldwide, I've told people, it was the Pearl Harbor moment of my life. Um, and so actually this photo in my office was my inspiration, taken by an incredible photographer by the name of Molly Humphreys. And I cold called her, Tony, at the beginning of the pandemic. And I then cold called a radio producer friend of mine. And these two amazing women jumped in to want to tell this story. And as a result, I accidentally stepped into narrative medicine. So our project picks up steam, and a year or so later, I have some university friends who say, you need to meet the director of our humanities center. And I was introduced to Renee Nicholson. And in our conversation, she said, hey, Ryan, how long have you been doing in narrative medicine? I said, what are you talking about? I have no idea what that is. And she's like, well, it's what you're doing. And so I tell people now that I accidentally backed into narrative medicine and its practices by creating a project as an artist. And I think the beauty of that is that I didn't overthink any of it. I basically created it um, with just unadulterated, creative preservation. Let's tell this story. And the gift of that is that I didn't get to overthink it. You know, as an internist, I can tell you, I can overthink things. Um, and then it was only later that I kind of realized that I was stepping into this larger tradition of narrative medicine. And so, because of the way that I stepped into it, my narrative medicine skills are self-taught, they're analog, they're practical, and as I've recently said, they were created by me and fit for purpose. And in that sense, they are wholly Appalachian. That's what we do in Appalachia, is we are often self-taught in something, and then we create a solution for a real world problem. And that's what healthcare is human is. It's an Appalachian small town rural community model of storytelling that came out of my unique point of view when COVID arrived.
Yeah, you remind me of Studs Terkel
Hmm.
and his work interviewing the common man, the
Hmm.
common people who worked hard, uncelebrated. And so
Hmm.
he really brought those people to life through his interview series, through a series of books,
Hmm.
and so forth. So you could be the Studs Terkel of West Virginia, with the soul of an artist on top of it. Which
Hmm.
I think really helps.
Hmm.
Uh, the idea of being a collector of stories and also your interest in art. I just wonder, when you talk to physicians about listening to patient stories and empathy, um, they're afraid to get into the story because it eats up a lot of time. So I guess my question is, how does your business model in your practice afford this approach of slowing down, close listening, really listening, and getting the long story, and also your longitudinal approach with patients? You see them over a long period of time. How does your business model adapt to this old-fashioned quote model of working with patients?
Yeah, that's a marvelous question, and I get asked that, and I have to say that a lot of what I do it is going to be hard for some other people to replicate because when I walk into the room, I've got over 20 years of experience of being the doctor, and you know, now healthcare is on a computer, and I curse at my computer multiple times a day because I kind of hate it. But at the same time, I have figured out how I can use it as best I can to track patients' information, tests, and lab work so I can make decisions. And so I really, Tony, have spent a lot of time really I prepare for visits. Like I will start in the morning very early here in my office, open up a note for the day, see who's coming in, review my last interaction with them, understand where we left things. And then I'll search around and see if they have seen other specialists and try to gather as much of that as I can before I see them. And that's very different because when I started my career, we would often just walk into an exam room with a paper chart. There's no paper chart anymore.
Yeah.
And I would try to piece this together while I was in there. Now I really want to be prepared for everything else that has happened. Like, oh, I know you went to the ER. Yes, I saw your surgery report. Yes, I've seen your biopsy. Yes, I know what your last kidney function is. And so I do that specifically so that when I walk in there, I can be present. And as I've told many medical students that I've mentored is I walk in there really to perform. I walk in there to be on, to be bright, engaged, handshake, hug, be present. How are you? It is good to see you. And I can step into that space by having that preparation. Um, Many of my colleagues don't think of healthcare as a performance. I do. I think that's why at the end of the day I'm emotionally exhausted and my brain is trashed because I've really tried to be emotionally on. And I do that by trying to give the patients as much time as I can by doing as much of the scut as I can before the visit. Um, and so that's just one man's way of doing this, but it's how I try to give as much time as I can to the patient.
Yeah, it sounds like the performance requires a lot of preparation. You don't
It
just go
does.
in cold and you do research. You're intimately involved in various aspects of their healthcare up to that point, and they must really appreciate that somebody actually paid attention and listened,
Mm,
read through my notes and knows me.
mm.
So that's must be quite a gift. So I had one more question for you, and this might be off the wall, but I read in your LinkedIn profile you love a good story and even better a good joke. What's the latest good joke that you've heard? Uh,
Oh, geez. I don't know if I can uncork one for you here. But with a name like McCarthy, I come from the Irish tradition of not letting the truth interfere with a great story. Um, my father was a great storyteller and a great joke teller, and he infused that into me. And I think there is, the Irish have been subject to a lot of tragedy, and have not succumbed because they see the humor in both mundane things and in terrible things. And so in some ways, that is just an ethos that I have here in Appalachia. I've often said, like, look, it's worse than you can imagine, but it's okay. And that humor is something that I'm always looking for. And um, after we finish, I'm going to head over to the hospital and I'm going to talk to a 50-year-old man who has a metastatic cancer that we found yesterday. And it wouldn't surprise me if at some point in his treatment that I really try to have some laughs with him, and to try to find things that we can gain that humor from because it sustains us. Um, and in my personal life, when I leave the office, I find that I really need things that are light and funny and frothy. And it brought me great joy not that long ago that one of my teenage sons had found a George Carlin book in our bookshelf and was just laughing hysterically to Brain Droppings by George Carlin. Um, I find that humor sustains me during the storm, and it keeps me from being cynical. So yes, I'm always interested to hear somebody's good joke or witty anecdote or funny comment on just about anything.
I grew up among Irish Catholics more than Italians throughout my entire life. So I understand completely the tradition of the Irish story that is often self-deprecating and
Mm.
an antidote to tragedy. And it reminds me of what my mother said about Jesus Christ. She said nobody would have followed him if he didn't have a good sense of humor. It was the first time I'd ever heard that, and it really made
Mm.
sense. You have to have so humor can again be kind of an antidote to
Totally. And I not that long ago, I have three kids. My youngest is my daughter who's 14, and I mean, she really tells me things in an honest way that I don't want to hear. So this girl here is actually 14 now, and
hmm.
that biting point of view really, Dad, do you miss having hair? That kind of stuff. And are you going to wear that? She says to me, you look like you work at a big box retail store. And I'm like, yeah, honey, actually, I do look like that. But I made a joke to her recently. I was like, honey, listen, when you have a face like this, you need to be intelligent, and it doesn't hurt to be funny. And it made her laugh, and she realized that maybe her father works in a world where intellect and humor really are the tools of the trade.
Well, look, Ryan, it was really just such a great conversation. Such a pleasure to meet you, and you're such a an asset to Narrative Mindworks. And I've been watching or looking at your photographs that you've posted, and I thought I got to put the voice to the pictures here. So I'm glad that we had this talk, and hope we can talk again. And thank you so much for being here.
You're so welcome. I really appreciate the invitation.